I'm Martha, 38 female. I'm an accountant, a profession that suits my personality perfectly. I like order, facts, and for things to add up correctly. My life with my wife, Sarah, was built on that same principle. A stable, loving partnership where everything made sense. We lived in a quiet suburban home, the kind with a small garden I was far too proud of. But in a single afternoon, I learned that some things don't add up, and that the numbers you trust can be manipulated by people who are supposed to love you. This is the story of how my brother-in-law tried to destroy my life over a lie, all starting at his own father's funeral. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The day of my father-in-law's funeral was heavy with a cold, persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everyone's bones. George Miller had been a kind, quiet man, a lover of classic films and intricate model ships. He was the calm center of a family that often felt like it was spinning just a little too fast. His passing wasn't unexpected. He'd been ill for a while, but the finality of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah, my wife, was a wreck. She'd been a daddy's girl through and through, and seeing her so broken made my own heart ache. I held her hand tightly as we sat in the front pew of the small chapel, my arm a constant, reassuring presence around her shoulders. Across the aisle sat her brother, David. He was a real estate agent with a smile that was always a little too wide and a handshake that felt more like a power play than a greeting. He was performing his role as the grieving son with theatrical flair, dabbing at his dry eyes with a pristine handkerchief and accepting condolences with a somber nod. His wife, Karen, sat beside him looking exhausted, while their son, Jake, a lanky 17-year-old, stared blankly at his phone until his father nudged him sharply. George hadn't been a wealthy man, but he had a few possessions he treasured. Chief among them was his vintage 1965 Omega Seamaster watch. It was a beautiful, classic timepiece he had received from his own father. He wore it every single day. In his final weeks, as he grew weaker, he'd taken it off and placed it in its velvet-lined box on his bedside table. He told both Sarah and David that the watch was a piece of family history, a symbol of the Miller legacy, modest as it was. He never specified who should inherit it, probably hoping his children would be mature enough to decide amongst themselves. That was George, always assuming the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. After the service, we all gathered back at George's small, tidy house for the reception. The home was filled with the scent of lilies and baked ham, a strange combination of grief and forced normalcy. Family members and old friends mingled in hushed tones, sharing memories of George. I spent most of my time making sure Sarah was eating something and trying to steer her away from conversations that were making her cry again. It was during a lull in the quiet chatter that David decided to make his move. He clinked a spoon against a glass, calling for everyone's attention. The room fell silent. "I just want to say thank you all for coming to honor my father," he began, his voice thick with what I now recognize as manufactured emotion. He was a great man, a simple man. He didn't have much, but what he had, he cherished. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room before it landed on me. He especially cherished his father's watch, the Omega, a family heirloom. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I had a feeling I knew where this was going. David's dislike for me had always been a simmering undercurrent in our family interactions. He saw me as an outsider who had somehow stolen his sister's affection. He could never accept that Sarah and I were simply happy together. "I went to his room earlier today," David continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just to feel close to him one last time. I looked for the watch, wanting to hold something of his, but the box, it was empty. The watch is gone." A collective gasp went through the room. A few aunts and uncles exchanged worried glances. Sarah, standing beside me, looked confused. "What are you talking about, David? Dad put it in the box himself 2 weeks ago." "I know he did," David said, turning his full attention to me. His eyes were cold and hard. And the only other person who was in that room with him for any length of time this past week, besides the nurses, was Martha. The silence in the room was no longer respectful, it was heavy with accusation. Every eye turned to me. I felt the blood drain from my face. I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. "David, what are you implying?" I asked, my voice barrel. Why a whisper? It felt thin and weak, and I hated myself for it. "I'm not implying anything," he said loudly, his voice booming with false righteousness. "I'm saying that my father's most prized possession has vanished, and you were the one with the most access. You're an accountant, aren't you? You know all about value." The jab was deliberate, painting me as a cold, calculating opportunist. I was stunned into silence. The sheer audacity of it to do this here, now, with his father's memory still fresh in the house, was breathtaking. Sarah immediately jumped to my defense. "That's insane, David. Martha would never do something like that. How dare you?" But the seed of doubt had been planted. I could see it in the shifting eyes of our relatives. They looked at me differently now. I wasn't just Sarah's wife anymore. I was the outsider, the suspect. David had chosen his moment perfectly. In a time of emotional vulnerability, people were more susceptible to suggestion, more willing to believe the worst. He had weaponized their grief against me. The watch was missing, and he had just supplied them with a convenient, easy-to-blame scapegoat. The heirloom was gone, and in its place was an ugly, baseless accusation that was about to tear our family apart. The worst part was, I had absolutely no way to prove my innocence. I had been in George's room. I had sat with him, read to him, held his hand. David had twisted those acts of care into a narrative of theft, and in that quiet, grief-stricken living room, people were starting to believe him. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. For a moment, nobody moved. It was as if David had detonated a bomb, and we were all caught in the silent, ringing aftermath. My mind was a whirlwind of denial and shock. Me, a thief? The idea was so absurd, so fundamentally opposite to everything I was, that I couldn't even formulate a proper defense. I just stood there, speechless, as 30 pairs of eyes scrutinized me, searching for a flicker of guilt. Sarah was the first to break the spell. Her voice, usually so gentle, was like steel. "Take it back, David. Right now, apologize to my wife." David scoffed, a theatrical, pitying sound. "Oh, Sarah, I know you want to defend her, I get it, but you have to face reality. The watch is gone. She was there. It's simple logic." He turned to his mother, Mary, a woman already frail with grief, who now looked utterly bewildered. "Mom, you know Dad would have wanted me to have that watch. He told me so. He would want me to protect his legacy." This was another lie. George had never promised the watch to anyone. But Mary, in her fragile state, just wrung her hands and looked from David to me, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of pain and confusion. She didn't know what to believe. David's words were a poison, and it was spreading quickly. "This is ridiculous," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I loved George. I would never ever steal from him, from any of you." "That's what a thief would say," an uncle muttered from the back of the room. Another aunt nodded in agreement. The tide was turning against me, swiftly and brutally. They were David's family, after all. I was the in-law, the addition. In a moment of crisis, the wagon circled, and I was left standing on the outside. The argument escalated quickly. Sarah was ferocious in my defense, her voice rising as she listed every instance of kindness I'd ever shown her father, every late-night hospital visit, every time I'd run errands for him without being asked. But David was a master manipulator. For every point Sarah made, he had a twisted counterpoint. "She was just playing the long game," he'd say with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Trying to get on his good side. She was probably after more than just the watch." The accusation was meant to isolate me completely, to paint me as a predator who had preyed on a dying man. It was vile. I felt a wave of nausea. I looked around at the faces of my family, my wife's family, and saw suspicion where there had once been warmth. I saw doubt where there had been acceptance. In the span of 5 minutes, David had successfully rewritten years of history. The breaking point came when David's mother, Mary, finally spoke. Her voice was a fragile whisper, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "Martha, dear," she said, avoiding my eyes, "perhaps it would be best if you left. This is a day for family to grieve, and this is all just too much." Her words hit me harder than David's ever could. She wasn't accusing me directly, but she was casting me out. She was choosing her son's narrative over the truth, over me. That was it. I was done. There was no defending myself against this. When the matriarch of the family asks you to leave, you leave. Sarah grabbed my arm. "No, if she leaves, I leave." "Don't be ridiculous, Sarah," David snapped. "This is about Dad, not your misplaced loyalty." I looked at Sarah, at the fierce love and defiance in her eyes, and I knew I couldn't let her blow up her entire family for this. Not like this. "No," I said softly, touching her cheek. "It's okay. I'll go, you stay. You need to be with your mom." "I need to be with you," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "We'll have plenty of time later," I promised, my voice cracking. "Go to your mother, she needs you." Giving her one last, desperate squeeze of the hand, I turned and walked away. The silence that followed my retreat was deafening. I could feel every eye on my back as I walked through the living room, down the short hallway, and out the front door into the miserable, gray drizzle. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't say goodbye to anyone else. I just walked. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, the engine off, the windows fogging up from my breath. The accusations echoed in my head. Thief, predator, outsider. I felt a profound sense of numbness, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. It wasn't just about a watch. It was about my character, my integrity. David hadn't just accused me of a crime. He had assassinated my reputation in front of the only family I had besides my own parents, who lived halfway across the country. He had taken their grief and twisted it into a weapon to use against me, and it had worked flawlessly. Why, I kept asking myself, why would he do this? The watch was valuable, yes, but not life, changingly so. It had to be about more than that. It was about power. It was about his resentment of me, his desire to be the sole protector of his father's legacy, the favored child. By painting me as a villain, he elevated himself to the role of hero, the grieving son protecting his family from a threat. I finally started the car, the engine rumbling to life with a shudder. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced back at the house. Through the bay window, I could see the silhouettes of the family huddled together, united in their suspicion and grief. I was on the outside looking in, officially exiled. The drizzle turned into a steady rain, blurring the world outside my windshield into a mess of gray streaks. It was a perfect reflection of how I felt inside. Shattered, indistinct, and utterly, hopelessly lost. The drive home was a blur. I operated on autopilot, my mind a chaotic storm of replayed conversations and hurt-filled expressions. Every time I blinked, I saw the faces of Sarah's family, their gazes a mixture of pity, suspicion, and outright condemnation. By the time I walked through my own front door, the numbness had begun to recede, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache of betrayal. Our home, usually a sanctuary of warmth and comfort, felt cold and empty. I wandered aimlessly from room to room, the silence amplifying the accusations still ringing in my ears. I collapsed onto the sofa, replaying David's words over and over. He had been so convincing, so certain. He had planted a seed of doubt, and the family, in their raw and vulnerable state, had let it grow into a forest of suspicion. How could they believe him? Did they really think so little of me after all these years? I had been with Sarah for a decade. We'd hosted countless holiday dinners, celebrated birthdays, and supported them through illnesses and hardships. Did none of that matter? Apparently not. Against the word of a blood relative, I was nothing. Hours passed. The gray afternoon faded into a dark, rainy evening. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat there in the dark, watching the rain trace paths down the window panes. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, a feeling I hadn't experienced since Sarah and I had built our life together. Now, even that felt threatened. Could our marriage withstand this? Sarah had defended me, yes, but this was her family. David was her brother, Mary her mother. Could she truly cut them off? Could I ask her to? My phone had been silent all afternoon. I imagined Sarah was caught in an impossible situation, trying to console her grieving mother while simultaneously defending her exiled wife. The thought of the pressure she must be under made my stomach churn with guilt and anxiety. Just as I was sinking into a particularly deep spiral of despair, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up the dark room. It was a text from Sarah. My heart leaped into my throat. I fumbled for the phone, my hands shaking slightly. I was half expecting a message of apology, a plea for understanding about her family's reaction, or worse, a message saying she was staying at her mother's for the night. But it was none of those things. The message contained no words, only a picture. I tapped to open it. The image was a bit grainy, clearly taken in a hurry and perhaps from a distance. It was a close-up shot of a person's wrist and forearm resting on the arm of a chair. And on the wrist was a watch. A very specific watch. A vintage Omega Seamaster with its distinctive S. Ilver dial and worn leather strap. It was George's watch. There was no doubt about it. My breath caught in my chest. For a moment, I was just relieved. The watch wasn't lost or stolen. It was safe. But then, a cold, sharp clarity cut through my emotional fog. I looked closer at the picture, at the sleeve of the dark suit jacket, at the youthful hand. It wasn't David's wrist. It was younger, thinner. It was the wrist of his son, Jake. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with a sickening thud. David had created a public spectacle, accusing me of stealing a watch that he knew, for a fact, was not missing. He had let his own son wear it to their grandfather's funeral. Had he given it to him, or had Jake taken it? The how didn't even matter as much as the why. David had seen an opportunity and seized it with both hands. He either orchestrated the entire thing, or, at the very least, saw the watch on his son's wrist and chose to use its disappearance as a weapon against me. A new emotion began to bubble up from the depths of my despair, hot and powerful. Rage. A pure, unadulterated fury that burned away the hurt and the confusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a family overreacting in their grief. This was a deliberate, malicious act of sabotage. David had lied. He had manipulated his entire family, desecrated the memory of his own father, and emotionally brutalized both me and his sister, all for some petty, vindictive game. My phone buzzed again. This time, a text message from Sarah appeared below the photo. He's wearing it, Jake. He was showing it off to his cousins in the den. I saw it. David is a monster. I'm on my way home. I love you. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of rage and a strange, fierce kind of relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't a thief. I was a victim of a calculated, cruel lie. The photo on my phone was the proof. It was my vindication. It was the truth in a single, grainy image. As I sat there, the screen of my phone casting a pale blue light on my face, the helplessness I'd been drowning in began to recede. It was replaced by something else, something cold and hard and resolute. David had made a grave mistake. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated his sister. He thought he could break us apart, but he had just given us a reason to fight back. He wanted to play a game of deception and accusation? Fine, but I was an accountant. I deal in facts, in evidence, in balancing the books, and I was about to conduct the most important audit of my life. The numbness was gone. The shock was gone. In their place, a plan began to form, piece by painful piece. David Miller had no idea what was coming for him. The game was on. When Sarah walked through the door 20 minutes later, her face was pale and her eyes were red-rimmed but blazing with a furious energy that matched my own. She didn't say a word. She just crossed the room, wrapped her arms around me, and held me so tightly I could barely breathe. We stood like that for a long time, a silent confirmation of everything that had just happened and everything we were about to do. We were a team. The world could fall apart around us, but we had each other. I confronted him, she finally said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. Quietly in the kitchen, I showed him the photo. I pulled back, my heart pounding. What did he do? He lied, of course, she said with a bitter laugh. He claimed Jake must have found it. He said the boy probably took it to feel close to his grandfather and that he, David, had no idea. He tried to turn it into some touching story about a grieving grandson. "And you believed him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Not for a second," Sarah said, her eyes like chips of ice. "His hands were shaking, Martha. He couldn't look me in the eye. He grabbed the watch from Jake and made a big show of finding it. He's probably calling Mom right now, telling her there was a big misunderstanding and that the missing heirloom has been miraculously recovered." "So he thinks this is over," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "He thinks he can smooth it all over, I'll get a half-hearted apology, and everything will go back to normal." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "He gets what he wanted, me and the family thinking you're capable of something like this, even if it was a mistake, and he gets to play the hero who found the watch." But we both knew it wasn't going to be that simple. An accusation like that doesn't just disappear. The stain remains. Some members of the family would always harbor a sliver of doubt about me. David's misunderstanding wouldn't erase the ugly scene he'd created. He had shown his true colors, and we couldn't unsee them. This wasn't just about the watch anymore. It was about the lie. It was about the deliberate, malicious intent behind it. Why had he done it? What was his endgame? "This isn't just about him not liking me, is it?" I asked, thinking out loud. "This feels bigger, more desperate." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression grim. "Dad's will is going to be read next week. It's not a huge estate, but there's the house, some savings, a few investments. It's supposed to be split 50-50 between David and me. No complications." "Supposed to be," I repeated, a cold understanding dawning on me. What if he wanted to complicate it? If he could make me look like a thief, a manipulative person who preys on the elderly? He could try to argue that I'm a negative influence on you. Maybe even try to get power of attorney or control over your half of the inheritance by painting you as incapable of managing it because you're with me. It sounded like something out of a movie, but it fit David's personality perfectly. He was a real estate agent who thrived on finding leverage and exploiting weakness. He saw everything as a negotiation, a battle to be won. "We need to know more," I said, my accountant brain kicking into high gear. "We need to understand his motive. People like David don't do things like this for no reason. There's always a financial angle." And so began our investigation. For the next few days, we operated like a covert intelligence agency out of our own home office. Sarah, with her knowledge of the family, started making quiet, careful calls to cousins and aunts she trusted, planting seeds of inquiry. She didn't reveal what we knew, but she asked questions. Had David seemed stressed lately? Had he mentioned any money troubles? Meanwhile, I took to the internet. As an accountant, I know that numbers don't lie. I started with public records, something I was very familiar with. David presented himself as a top-tier real estate agent, Mr. Success, with his fancy car and designer suits. But the public records told a different story. I found a second mortgage taken out on his house 6 months ago. Then I found a lien against his property for unpaid contractor fees on a kitchen remodel. His social media was a carefully curated illusion of luxury vacations and expensive dinners. But the financial documents told a story of debt and desperation. Digging deeper, I used my professional resources to do a soft credit check, which is perfectly legal with the information I had. The results were staggering. He had maxed out credit cards, a high-interest personal loan, and a car payment that was astronomical. The man wasn't just stretched thin, he was on the verge of financial collapse. His real estate commissions, the lifeblood of his income, must have dried up. He was drowning. "This is it," I told Sarah, spreading the printouts across our dining room table. "This is the motive. He's desperate for money. Your father's inheritance isn't just a nice bonus for him, it's a lifeline. And he doesn't just want his half, he wants it all." Sarah stared at the papers, her face a mask of disillusionment. "So he tried to get rid of you to get to my share. He thought if he could isolate me from you, I'd be easier to manipulate. He'd help me manage my inheritance and just absorb it into his own accounts to pay off his debts." It was a cold, cruel, and calculated plan. The public accusation wasn't just an act of petty revenge. It was the opening move in a financial chess game. He was trying to checkmate us before we even knew we were playing. The watch incident was designed to be a character assassination, a way to discredit me so that no one would believe me when I raised alarms about David's inevitable financial advice to Sarah. We now had the what, the how, and the why. We had the photo of Jake with the watch, our ace in the hole, and we had the mountain of financial evidence that exposed David's perfect life as a house of cards. The question was, what were we going to do with it? A simple "I told you so" wouldn't be enough. He had publicly humiliated me in front of the entire family. He deserved a public reckoning. He had tried to tear our lives apart out of pure greed. He needed to be exposed, not just for what he did, but for who he truly was. The gears in my mind were turning, fitting pieces together, not for a balance sheet, but for a strategy. The storm was coming for David Miller, and we were going to make sure he was standing right in the center of it when it hit. The week following the funeral was one of the strangest and most tense of my life. On the surface, things attempted to return to a semblance of normalcy, but underneath, there was a chasm of unspoken words and unresolved tension. As Sarah had predicted, David had launched a full-scale damage control operation. He called Sarah's mother, Mary, and fed her a beautifully crafted story about how young Jake, in his grief, had quietly taken his grandfather's watch to feel connected to him. David painted himself as the distraught father who had only just discovered this, mortified that his son's innocent act had caused such a terrible misunderstanding. NG. He then sent me a text message that was a masterpiece of corporate non-apology. Martha, it read, heard there was a big mix-up with Dad's watch. So sorry for the confusion during such an emotional time for all of us. Let's put it behind us for the sake of the family. He didn't apologize for accusing me. He didn't apologize for the humiliation or the pain. He apologized for the confusion. He was trying to sweep the entire incident under the rug, to frame it as a collective emotional overreaction in which we were all equally at fault. Sarah and I read the message together, our anger simmering. He truly thought he could get away with it, that a single, dismissive text was enough to erase his calculated cruelty. The family, for the most part, seemed to want to believe him. It was easier. Acknowledging the truth that David had maliciously lied would mean facing an uncomfortable reality about one of their own. So they accepted his flimsy explanation. The phone calls Sarah received from her aunts and cousins were filled with phrases like, "Oh, thank goodness it was all a misunderstanding," and David must feel just awful. No one called me to apologize for their suspicion. No one acknowledged the pain I had been put through. In their minds, the books were balanced, and the issue was closed. But for us, it was far from over. We had the evidence of his financial ruin and the photo of the watch on Jake's wrist. We spent our evenings huddled together, meticulously planning our next move. We decided that a private confrontation would be useless. David would just lie, deny, and gaslight us. A public accusation had been his weapon of choice, so a public revelation of the truth would be ours. The opportunity presented itself perfectly, the reading of George's will. The lawyer had scheduled it for the following Saturday at his office. The entire immediate family was required to be there. Mary, David and his wife Karen, and Sarah and I. It was the ideal stage. It was a formal setting, a place where emotions would be high, but where facts and legal documents held sway. This wouldn't be a chaotic, grief-fueled gathering like the funeral reception. This would be a boardroom reckoning. Our plan was simple but had to be executed perfectly. We had two objectives. First, to expose David's lie about the watch in a way that was undeniable. Second, to reveal his desperate financial situation, providing the family with the undeniable motive for his actions. We didn't want to destroy him completely, but we needed to neutralize him. We needed to ensure he could never again wield influence over Sarah or her mother, and we needed to reclaim my integrity. In the days leading up to the reading, Sarah and I worked as a single unit. She handled the emotional and familial side of the preparations. She had a long, difficult conversation with her mother, Mary. She didn't reveal our plan, but she gently pushed back against the misunderstanding narrative. She told her mother how deeply hurt she and I had been, and how David's actions had broken something fundamental in their family. She was laying the groundwork, preparing her mother for the idea that there was more to the story than David had let on. My role was analytical and logistical. I compiled all the financial documents into a clear, concise portfolio. I printed out the public records of the second mortgage and the lien. I created a simple summary sheet that showed his debt-to-income ratio, a stark and undeniable picture of his financial distress. I also had the photo Sarah had taken enlarged slightly and printed on high-quality photo paper. It was our smoking gun. I then put everything into a large manila envelope. The night before the will reading, the anxiety in our house was palpable. We sat in the living room, the envelope resting on the coffee table between us like an unexploded bomb. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. "This is going to break my family, Martha, whatever is left of it." "He already broke it," I responded gently, taking her hand. "He broke it when he chose greed over love, lies over truth. We're not the ones breaking it, we're just turning on the lights so everyone can see the damage that's already been done. Your mom deserves to know who her son really is. You deserve to be free from his manipulation." She squeezed my hand, her resolve hardening. "You're right, he's counting on us to be quiet. He's counting on our desire for peace to protect him. He's not going to get it." We went to bed that night feeling a strange mixture of dread and determination. It felt like the calm before a hurricane. We had prepared our shelter, we had boarded up the windows, and we knew exactly where the storm was going to hit. There was nothing left to do but wait for morning and walk into the eye of it. David thought he had weathered the little squall he had created at the funeral. He had no idea that a Category 5 was heading straight for high M and that we were guiding it. The next day, the books would finally be balanced, one way or another. The lawyer's office was exactly as you'd imagine: mahogany furniture, shelves lined with thick, leather-bound books, and an air of quiet, expensive solemnity. The room felt cold, despite the weak morning sun filtering through the blinds. Mary, Sarah's mother, sat looking small and fragile in one of the large client chairs. David and his wife, Karen, sat opposite us. David gave me a curt, professional nod, as if we were strangers about to engage in a business transaction. He was radiating a smug confidence, clearly believing he had successfully navigated the crisis he'd created. He thought he had won. Sarah and I sat together, her hand resting on my knee under the table, a small anchor of support. The manila envelope with all our evidence lay in my briefcase at my feet. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my face was a calm, neutral mask. I was an accountant about to present a final, irrefutable audit. The lawyer, Mr. Davison, a kind-looking man in his 60s who had known the family for years, began by offering his condolences. He then opened a folder and began to read George's last will and testament. It was simple and straightforward, just as Sarah had said it would be. The house was to be sold, with the proceeds divided equally between his two children, Sarah and David. His savings, investments, and personal effects were to be similarly split. There were no surprises, no last-minute changes. As Mr. Davison finished reading, a look of profound relief washed over David's face. This was it, his lifeline. He probably already had the money spent in his head, mortgages paid, debts cleared, the illusion of his success maintained. He leaned back in his chair, a subtle, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Well, that all seems to be in order," David said, his voice smooth as silk. "Dad was always a fair man." He looked over at Sarah. "We can talk about listing the house later this week. I have some colleagues who can give us a great rate." He was already trying to take control. This was our moment. "Before we move on," I said, my voice clear and steady. Every head in the room turned to me. I had been silent until this point, and my speaking up was clearly unexpected. "There is one personal effect of George's that I believe we need to discuss." David's smile tightened. "Martha, I really think this is a family matter. The will has been read." "This is very much a family matter," Sarah interjected, her voice firm. "And since Martha was the one who was publicly accused of stealing it, I think she has every right to speak." Mary looked back and forth between us, a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. Mr. Davison, sensing the tension, simply folded his hands and waited. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the manila envelope. I opened it and took out the glossy 8x10 photograph. I slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of David. The photo was unmistakable: Jake's wrist, and on it, George's Omega watch. The picture had been taken at the funeral reception, at the exact time David was claiming the watch had been stolen. David stared at the photo. The color drained from his face. For the first time since I'd known him, his confident mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure panic. Karen, his wife, leaned over to look, her eyes widening in confusion. "What is this?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. "That," I said, my gaze locked on David, "is a photo of your grandson, Jake, wearing his grandfather's watch at the funeral reception. It was taken by Sarah at the same time that David was in the living room, accusing me of having stolen it." A deathly silence fell over the room. David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked trapped, a cornered animal. I already explained this," he stammered, his composure crumbling. "Jake took it. It was a misunderstanding." "Was it?" I pressed, my voice remaining level and calm. "Because a misunderstanding is when you think something is lost when it is. What you did was different. You knew the watch wasn't missing, or at the very least, you chose not to find out before you launched a vicious, public attack on my character. You let your entire family believe I was a thief." I then took out the second set of documents from the envelope, the financial records. I didn't slide these across the table. I handed them directly to Mary. "I think you should see this, Mary," I said softly. As an accountant, I was concerned about why David would do something so cruel, so I looked into it. These are public records: a second mortgage on their house, a contractor's lien. David is in serious financial trouble. He's drowning in debt. Karen gasped and shot a horrified look at her husband. It was clear she hadn't known the full extent of their financial problems. "She has no right," David exploded, finally finding his voice. "See," he shot up from his chair, his face red with fury and shame. "This is an invasion of my privacy. It's illegal." "It's all public record, David," I replied calmly. "Nothing illegal about it. You see, it all adds up now. You weren't just being cruel, you were being strategic. You needed money desperately. You knew the inheritance was coming. Your plan was to discredit me, to drive a wedge between me and Sarah, to isolate her from me. You hoped to paint me as a villain so you could then step in as the protective brother, offering to help Sarah manage her inheritance. Help it right into your own bank account to pay off your debts." Every word landed like a physical blow. Mary was staring at the papers in her hand, her face ashen. Karen was openly crying now, looking at her husband with an expression of utter betrayal. David stood there, exposed and defeated, his blustering rage deflating into pathetic, shallow breaths. "David," Mary whispered, her voice cracking, "is this true? Did you lie?" He couldn't answer. He just sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The truth was out, laid bare on the polished surface of the lawyer's table, cold, hard, and undeniable. There was no escaping it. His plan, his lies, his entire carefully constructed facade had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. The reckoning had arrived, and it was even more devastating than I had imagined. The aftermath of the revelation in the lawyer's office was not loud or explosive. It was a quiet, shattering collapse. There was no more yelling from David. There was only the sound of his wife Karen's soft sobs and his mother Mary's shaky, heartbroken breaths. The smug, confident man who had walked into that room was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell of shame and failure. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, least of all his mother. Mr. Davison, the lawyer, handled the situation with professional grace. He quietly suggested that perhaps it would be best for everyone to take some time to process this information. He gathered the will documents, and we all filed out of the room in a grim, silent procession. In the hallway, Karen turned to David, her face streaked with tears and fury. "We are going home, and you are going to tell me everything," she said, her voice low and dangerous. It was clear their own personal reckoning was just beginning. Mary looked at Sarah and me, her eyes filled with a pain so deep it was hard to witness. "I am so sorry, Martha," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I am so sorry I ever doubted you." She reached out and squeezed my hand, her touch frail but sincere. An apology. It was what I had wanted, but seeing the utter devastation on this poor woman's face, I felt a pang of pity instead of triumph. She was a victim in this too, manipulated by her own son in her moment of greatest vulnerability. "It's okay, Mary," I said, and I meant it. "It's over now." Sarah hugged her mother tightly, and they cried together for a few moments before we helped her to her car. The ride home with Sarah was quiet. We held hands, the tension of the past week finally draining away, leaving us exhausted but unified. We had done it. We had exposed the truth. There was no triumphant feeling, no surge of victorious glee. There was just a profound, quiet sense of justice and a deep sadness for the family that had been torn apart by one man's greed. In the weeks that followed, the fractures in the Miller family became permanent chasms. Karen left David, taking Jake with her. The financial exposure, combined with the depth of his deception, was the final straw for her. She was done living a lie. The last we heard, David was forced to sell their heavily mortgaged house and was facing bankruptcy. He had lost his family, his home, and any shred of respect he once commanded. He had gambled everything on a cruel lie, and he had lost spectacularly. Mary, heartbroken, decided to sell her house and move into a smaller condo in a retirement community a few towns over. The memories in her old home were too painful. Her relationship with David was shattered, perhaps irreparably. She spoke to him on the phone occasionally, but the trust and warmth were gone. Sarah and I focused on healing. We took the inheritance that was rightfully hers and invested it wisely. We used a small portion of it for a trip, just the two of us, to a quiet beach where we could walk for miles and talk about everything and nothing. It was a reset button for our lives. The ordeal had been horrific, but it had forged our bond into something unbreakable. We had faced the worst kind of betrayal together and had come out the other side stronger than ever. We also made a decision to distance ourselves from the wreckage of her family. We still saw Mary regularly, meeting her for lunch and helping her with errands, but we politely declined invitations to wider family gatherings. The trust had been broken too severely. We needed to build a new one based on honesty and peace, away from the toxic dynamics that had almost consumed us. Months later, I was working in my home office when I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line was simply, "I'm sorry." It was from David. The email was short and rambling, a pathetic attempt at explaining his actions. He talked about the pressure, the debts, the fear of failure. He admitted he had targeted me because he was jealous of my stability and my relationship with Sarah. He said he was trying to get help. I read the email and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even satisfaction. He was just a sad, broken man who had made terrible choices. His apology was for him, not for me. It was a step on his own path to whatever came next. I deleted the email without replying. My books were balanced. His were not my concern anymore. My life was with Sarah in our quiet home with our little garden. The world we had built together was our sanctuary, a place where things made sense, where love was the only currency that mattered, and where trust was the most valuable asset of all, an asset I would never, ever take for granted again.